Night falls over the Persian Gulf. Radar screens glow in dimly lit control rooms. Green pulses sweeping across black space. Operators lean closer, watching, waiting. Then, movement. Signals begin to cluster, fast, deliberate, closing in. Somewhere in the darkness, missiles are already in the air. Across Iran, sirens cut through the night, a rising mechanical wail that echoes through cities and deserts alike. People look up, but there's nothing to see yet. Only the sound, only the knowing. This is not a warning. It's already begun. In underground bunkers, commanders issue orders over crackling radios. Air defenses activate, interceptors prepare. Every second now matters, because this isn't a limited strike. It isn't a message. This is pressure, sustained, expanding. And Iran is facing it largely alone. No fleets arriving over the horizon, no allied aircraft crossing into its airspace, no sudden shift in the balance of power, just statements, condemnations, carefully chosen words, but no help. And that raises a question far more dangerous than the missiles themselves. If Iran has partners, powerful ones, then where are they now, when it matters most? Because what's happening in this moment is not just a war. It's a test of something far bigger, how far alliances really go when the cost becomes real. For years, the image was clear. Iran was not alone. It stood alongside two of the most powerful nations on Earth, Russia and China. They trained together, traded together, spoke the language of partnership on the global stage, joint naval exercises in distant waters, energy deals worth billions, diplomatic alignment against Western pressure. From the outside, it looked like the foundation of something stronger, a quiet but growing axis, a counterweight. And when tensions rose, when confrontation with the United States became more likely, that assumption hardened into expectation. If war ever came, surely these partners would not stand aside. Surely they couldn't afford to. Because Iran is not just another country. It sits at the crossroads of energy, geography, and influence, a pressure point in the global system. If it collapses, or even weakens significantly, the consequences ripple outward, into markets, into alliances, into the balance of power itself. So when the strikes begin, when escalation becomes undeniable, the world watches for movement, not from Iran, but from Moscow, from Beijing. And at first, there is a response. Statements are released, condemnations follow, strong words, carefully crafted, calling for restraint, for de-escalation, for peace. Diplomats speak of stability, of sovereignty, of the dangers of further conflict. On paper, it sounds like support. But then, nothing else happens. No military deployments, no emergency aid convoys crossing borders, no coordinated defense effort, no visible shift in posture that would suggest these nations are preparing to stand beside Iran in anything more than words. And that silence, that absence of action, begins to feel louder than any speech. Because in moments like this, alliances are not measured by what is said, they're measured by what is risked. And risk is exactly what's missing. The deeper you look, the more the picture begins to change. Because despite the language of partnership, China has never bound itself to Iran with a formal security guarantee. No treaty that compels intervention, no obligation that forces its hand. In fact, China has avoided most military alliances altogether, choosing flexibility over commitment. Its only true security pact dates back decades with North Korea. And even that relationship is complicated. Iran, by comparison, sits far outside China's core strategic focus. Important, yes, but not essential. Not the kind of partner you go to war for. And Russia, despite years of cooperation, arms deals, shared interests, overlapping enemies, has drawn a similar line. Iran is useful, but it is not central, not to Russia's immediate security, not to its most urgent priorities. There is no mutual defense clause waiting to be activated, no automatic response, just a relationship built on convenience, not commitment. And in times of peace, that difference is easy to ignore. But in war, it becomes impossible to hide, Because what once looked like an alliance now starts to look like something else entirely, something looser, more calculated, a relationship defined not by loyalty, but by limits. This is the kind of moment alliances are built for, not trade deals, not joint statements, not carefully worded diplomacy, but this: escalation, uncertainty, the real possibility of war expanding beyond control. The United States is no longer watching from a distance. Forces begin to move. Marines deploy into the region. The 82nd Airborne prepares for rapid response. Carrier groups shift position. Aircraft, missiles, and personnel flow steadily into the Middle East. This is not symbolic. It's preparation. The kind that signals something larger may be coming, not just strikes, but the possibility of a broader confrontation. And history tells us something very clear about moments like this. When a nation faces overwhelming pressure, its allies step forward, not always into direct combat, but visibly, decisively. They reinforce, they deter, they complicate the enemy's calculations. Because even the suggestion of escalation, even the possibility that a conflict could widen, can be enough to change everything. That's how alliances work. They don't just fight wars, they prevent them from growing. So as American forces reposition, as tension builds with every passing hour, the expectation rises. Surely now something will shift. Surely now China will act to protect its energy. Lifelines, its regional interests. Surely now Russia will step in to support a partner, to push back against U.S. expansion, because if not now, then when? But again, nothing. No sudden deployments from Beijing, no Russian forces moving toward the theater, no indication that either power is preparing to match the scale of what's unfolding. Instead, the same pattern repeats: statements, warnings, calls for restraint, but no escalation. And that absence becomes harder to explain. Because this is not a minor crisis. Iran is under sustained pressure, its infrastructure at risk, its position in the region increasingly unstable. This is exactly the kind of scenario that should trigger deeper involvement, the kind that tests whether partnerships are real or just convenient. And yet, both China and Russia hold back, deliberately, carefully, almost patiently, which raises a far more unsettling possibility. What if this isn't hesitation? What if it's not weakness or inability? What if both countries are choosing not to intervene because, in some way, this war is working in their favor? Because from a distance, away from the immediate danger, there are advantages beginning to emerge. Advantages that only exist as long as the United States remains deeply involved here. And if that's true, then this isn't a failure of alliance, it's something far more calculated. To understand China's silence, you have to shift the map, not to the Middle East, but thousands of kilometers east, to the South China Sea, to Taiwan, to the narrow corridors of water where global power is quietly being contested every single day. Because for China, this is the center of gravity, not Iran, not the Persian Gulf. Its military planning, its long-term strategy, its sense of urgency, all of it is focused here, on its immediate neighborhood, on the territories and sea lanes it considers vital. Everything else comes second, and that changes everything, because while Iran matters to China, it does in a very specific way. It is not the kind of partner Beijing is willing to fight for. There is no deep military alliance, no binding obligation, no shared command structure, only a relationship built around something far more practical: energy. Oil flows from Iran into China in massive quantities, tankers crossing long distances, feeding an economy that depends on constant supply. In recent years, the scale has been staggering. China purchasing the overwhelming majority of Iran's oil exports. On paper, that sounds like dependence, like something worth defending. But China has prepared for disruption, strategic reserves, alternative suppliers, flexible sourcing, enough to absorb shocks, at least for a time, which means even if the flow from Iran is interrupted, even if the Strait of Hormuz becomes unstable, China does not immediately collapse, it adapts, and more. Importantly, it calculates. Because while the war creates risk in one area, it creates opportunity in another. As the United States increases its presence in the Middle East, something else begins to happen quietly, almost invisibly. Attention shifts, resources move, military assets that were once positioned in the Indo-Pacific start to leave. Intercept systems, naval groups, personnel, reassigned, redirected, reprioritized, not because the U.S. wants to weaken its position in Asia, but because it has to respond here to the immediate crisis. And from China's perspective, that is the opportunity. Every ship that sails west is a ship not patrolling near its coastline. Every missile system redeployed is one less layer of defense in the region China cares about most. Every hour of focus spent on Iran is an hour not spent watching China's movements. This is not accidental, it's structural. A global power can only concentrate so much force in so many places at the same time, and right now, that force is being pulled away. For China's military planners, this isn't chaos. It's space, time, breathing room, a chance to operate with less pressure, less scrutiny, less immediate risk of confrontation in its own backyard. And the longer this continues, the more that advantage grows. Because wars don't just consume weapons, they consume attention, logistics, political capital. They stretch supply lines, they drain stockpiles. Missile interceptors used here are interceptors not available somewhere else. Ships deployed here cannot be everywhere at once. And China understands this better than most. It doesn't need to win this war. It doesn't need to intervene. It simply needs it to continue long enough for the balance to begin shifting in its favor. Which is why its response feels so restrained, so measured, not because it's confused, not because it's unprepared, but because from Beijing's perspective, this is not a crisis to stop. It's a situation to observe, to manage, and, quietly, to benefit from. The shift doesn't happen all at once. There's no single announcement, no moment where everything clearly changes. Instead, it unfolds quietly. One system at a time, one deployment after another, a missile defense battery moved, a naval group reassigned, a contingent of troops redirected. Individually, each decision makes sense. Respond to the crisis, stabilize the region, prepare for escalation. But together, they begin to tell a different story. Because as the United States reinforces the Middle East, it inevitably draws strength from somewhere else, and that somewhere else is often the Indo-Pacific, a region that until now has been the central focus of American military planning, carefully balanced, heavily monitored, constantly reinforced. But balance is fragile. And when pressure builds in one part of the world, it has to be relieved from another. So systems once positioned to deter China, like advanced missile defenses stationed in allied territories, are no longer fixed. They move. Naval assets that once operated in contested waters shift course. Marine units stationed near key flashpoints begin to rotate out, not permanently, but long enough to create gaps. And those gaps matter. Because deterrence isn't just about strength, it's about presence, the visible, constant reminder that any move will be met with resistance. And when that presence thins, even slightly, the equation begins to change. From Beijing's perspective, this is where the advantage becomes tangible, not in dramatic breakthroughs, not in sudden victories, but in subtle shifts. A little less pressure in contested seas, a little more freedom of movement, a little more uncertainty in the calculations of others. And uncertainty is powerful, because it forces hesitation, it complicates decisions, it opens doors that would otherwise remain closed. Meanwhile, the United States finds itself drawn deeper into a different kind of conflict, one that consumes resources at a steady, relentless pace. Missile interceptors launched to defend against incoming threats, precision munitions used to strike targets, logistics chains stretched across continents, each action necessary, each response justified, but each one also finite. Stockpiles shrink, maintenance cycles accelerate, replacement becomes a race against time, and all of it is happening far from the region where China expects its most critical challenges to unfold. This is the hidden advantage, not something declared, but something accumulated. Because while one power is actively engaged, another is conserving strength. While one is reacting, the other is watching, learning, adjusting, waiting, and perhaps, most importantly, timing. Because China does not need immediate results. It operates on a longer horizon, years, not weeks, trends, not moments. And from that perspective, a prolonged conflict elsewhere is not a distraction, it's leverage. The longer attention remains divided, the longer resources remain committed, the longer strategic focus drifts away, the more space China has to shape its own environment, to strengthen its position, to prepare for its own objectives, and to do so with less interference. So when China chooses not to intervene, when it limits its role to statements and diplomacy, it's not stepping back, it's stepping aside, allowing the situation to evolve in a way that quietly shifts the balance without firing a single shot. If China's strategy is about patience, Russia's is about survival. Because unlike Beijing, Moscow is already deeply engaged in its own war. Ukraine is not a distant concern. It is the center of Russia's military, economic, and political focus. Every decision, every resource, every calculation runs through that battlefield. And that changes how Russia sees Iran. Because while the two countries cooperate, while they trade weapons, share intelligence, and align against Western pressure, Iran is not where Russia's future is being decided. Ukraine is. The front lines there stretch for hundreds of kilometers, a constant grind of artillery, drones, and maneuver, and it consumes everything: ammunition, equipment, manpower, attention. So when conflict escalates in the Middle East, Russia is not looking for another war to fight. It's looking for ways to manage the one it already has. And in that context, Iran becomes something different, not a partner to defend at all costs, but a variable, a situation that can be used. Because while the war places pressure on Iran, it creates opportunities for Russia, especially in energy. Global oil markets react instantly to instability. Prices surge, supply chains tighten, uncertainty spreads, and when Iranian exports are disrupted, or when the Strait of Hormuz faces the threat of closure, countries begin searching for alternatives. Fast, reliable suppliers become more valuable overnight, and Russia is one of the few capable of filling that gap. Major economies, China, India, others, still need energy. They cannot afford shortages, so they turn to what's available, what's accessible, what's flowing. And increasingly, that means Russia. More demand, higher prices, expanded influence, all driven not by direct action, but by the existence of the conflict itself. For an economy heavily tied to fossil fuels, this is significant. Revenue that supports the state, funds the war effort, stabilizes internal pressure, and all of it grows stronger. The longer instability persists elsewhere. But energy is only part of the equation. There's another advantage, less visible, but just as critical: attention. Because as the United States becomes more deeply involved in Iran, its focus begins to stretch, resources shift, priorities divide, and that has consequences for Ukraine. Every missile interceptor sent to the Middle East is one not available for Kiev. Every shipment of precision weapons redirected is one less reinforcing Ukrainian defenses. Every logistical effort committed elsewhere reduces what can be sustained on the European front. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, over time. And in a prolonged conflict, those small shifts accumulate. They matter. Because wars like the one in Ukraine are not decided in a single moment. They are shaped by endurance, by supply, by who can sustain pressure longer. And if that pressure is even slightly reduced, the balance begins to move. From Moscow's perspective, this is the real calculation, not whether to intervene directly in Iran, but whether the situation, as it stands, already serves its interests. Because Russia doesn't need to send troops, it doesn't need to escalate publicly. It can remain just outside the conflict, while still influencing it, quietly, indirectly, through intelligence, through coordination, through information shared at the right moment, in the right place, support that never crosses the line into open confrontation, but still shapes outcomes on the ground, and crucially, without risking a direct clash with the United States, because that is the line Russia cannot afford to cross, not now, not while it is already engaged elsewhere. So instead, it plays a different game, one of distance, of calculation, of extracting advantage without absorbing the cost, which means that, like China, Russia's absence is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of choice, a deliberate decision to let the war unfold while benefiting from it on its own terms. From the outside, it still looks like distance, like restraint. Two major powers watching from the sidelines, choosing not to intervene. But distance can be deceptive, because influence doesn't always arrive with troops or ships or declarations. Sometimes it moves in silence, behind closed doors, through channels that never appear on the surface. And in this kind of conflict, that matters just as much. Russia, in particular, has spent years refining this approach, operating in the spaces between war and peace, between involvement and denial, where actions can shape outcomes without triggering direct retaliation. Because the goal is not to win Iran's war, it's to benefit from it without becoming part of it, and that means staying just far enough away while still remaining close enough to matter. Information becomes one of the most powerful tools. Satellite data, signals intelligence, patterns of movement, details that can reveal where forces are positioned, how they are moving, what they might do next, shared selectively, carefully, not enough to provoke a direct response, but enough to tilt the balance in small, meaningful ways. Because in modern conflict, knowledge is leverage, and even a slight advantage can change outcomes on the ground. At the same time, the battlefield extends far beyond Iran itself. It stretches into supply chains, into production lines, into the global flow of weapons and defense systems. Factories ramp up, stockpiles are drawn down, replacement becomes urgent, and every system sent into this conflict is one that cannot be used elsewhere. This is where the pressure quietly builds, not in dramatic headlines, but in numbers. Interceptor inventories shrinking, precision munitions becoming harder to replace, maintenance cycles tightening under constant use, and none of it happens instantly. But over weeks, over months, it accumulates. Because modern militaries are not unlimited. They rely on production, on logistics, on time. And time is exactly what prolonged conflict consumes. For Russia, this creates an indirect advantage, not by defeating an opponent outright, but by stretching it, forcing it to operate across multiple theaters, to divide attention, to allocate resources under pressure, and in that environment, efficiency drops, decisions become harder, trade-offs become unavoidable, support one front or another, prioritize one threat or risk another, growing unchecked. These are the kinds of dilemmas that don't appear on maps, but shape the outcome of wars. And Russia understands this. It doesn't need dramatic victories. It needs pressure, sustained, relentless, distributed, the kind that weakens over time rather than shatters in a single moment. So while Iran fights visibly, launching defenses, absorbing strikes, managing escalation, others operate in the background, adjusting the conditions, shaping the environment, benefiting from every additional day the conflict continues. And perhaps the most striking part of all this is how little of it is acknowledged. Because there are no announcements for this kind of involvement, no declarations of support, no clear lines drawn, only outcomes, subtle shifts, gradual changes, advantages that appear slowly but persist, which means that what looks like absence is not absence at all. it's participation, just at a level designed to avoid the cost while still capturing the benefit. And as long as that balance holds, there is very little incentive for it to change. By now, the pattern is impossible to ignore. Iran is under pressure. The United States is deeply engaged. The conflict continues to expand in scope, in cost, in consequence. And yet, the two powers that were expected to stand beside Iran remain just outside the fight, not absent, not unaware, but deliberately removed. And that forces a realization that is uncomfortable, but necessary. Because what we're seeing is not a failure of alliances, it's the true nature of them. Modern alliances are not built on loyalty. They are built on interest, on calculation, on cost, on what each side is willing to risk and what it stands to gain. And when the cost becomes too high, when the risks outweigh the benefits, those relationships begin to reveal their limits. China does not intervene because Iran is not central to its long-term strategy. Its priorities lie closer to home, its ambitions focused on regions where the outcome directly shapes its future. Everything else is secondary. Russia does not intervene because it cannot afford to. Its resources are already committed. Its most critical battle is being fought elsewhere, and anything that weakens its opponent without requiring direct involvement is not a problem. It's an advantage. So what looks at first like abandonment is something far more structured, disciplined, each country following its own logic, its own priorities, its own definition of success. And within that logic, Iran was never guaranteed protection, only partnership under certain conditions, conditions that no longer apply. Because war changes everything. It strips away assumptions, tests relationships, forces decisions that reveal what truly matters. And in this case, what truly matters is not solidarity, it's strategy, cold, measured, unemotional, the kind that doesn't react to pressure but adapts around it, which means the real story here is not about who failed to act. It's about why acting was never the plan. The missiles will stop eventually. The deployments will stabilize, the headlines will fade, but what this war reveals will remain. Because the battlefield was never just Iran. It stretched far beyond it, into oceans, into economies, into the quiet calculations of global power. While one nation fought to defend itself, others adjusted the balance of the world around it. The United States committed forces, attention, and resources pulled into a conflict that demanded immediate response. China gained time, space to operate, a brief easing of pressure in the region that matters most to its future. Russia gained leverage, higher energy demand, a subtle shift in focus away from its own war. And Iran stood at the center of it all, not just as a participant in the conflict, but as the ground on which larger strategies unfolded. Because this is what modern conflict has become, not just battles between enemies, but opportunities for others. Wars where the outcome isn't only decided by those who fight, but by those who choose not to. And the longer a war continues, the more those unseen advantages grow. Which leaves a final question, not about this conflict, but about the next one. When the pressure rises again, when another nation looks to its fee, partners for support. Will anything be different, or will the same pattern repeat? Careful words, measured distance, and decisions made not on loyalty, but on interest. Because in the end, that may be the clearest lesson of all. Not who stands with you, but how far they're willing to go when it truly matters.